Hey Addison. Okay, so you struggle with adding clothes and truly rendering forms accurately. Your hair feels flat and skirt doesn't seem to make sense. Uh, you want to know how to light things and make things look fluffier, and how do you render forms to look more 3D, and how would I clothe characters? Okay, well, these are two huge topics, so I don't think I can do both of them. I'm just going to do this one. How do you render forms to look more 3D? The short answer for this one is look at reference and study it and try and copy what you see. I can go into more details. I'm not great with clothing, but I can go into more details. But it's a huge topic. So this is already more than enough. It's a big topic as well. How do you render forms to look more 3D? Okay, so let's deal with that. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of all the saturation. And we don't need to be thinking about color at all right now. I'm just going to lower the value as well. So it's just a bit easier for me to see what's going on. All right, so let me give you a quick rundown of basic shapes. So basic forms that we have are cube or like rectangular prism, and we have a sphere, we have a cone, and we have a cylinder. So these are pretty much all you need to understand in order to render most things. They're just like combinations of these. So you need to know how to render each one of these. And there are different lighting circumstances, of course, but generally they follow similar ideas. So what separates these? Okay, so let's just start by coming up with 3 tones. Let's say this is our shadow, and then this is like a middle, and then this is like the color of the background. Let's just call that the light. Okay. So square is pretty easy. Wherever the light's hitting, let's say the light is hitting from this, maybe this angle, so it's slightly above. So this area, this side is not getting hit by light really. This side is getting hit, and this side is getting hit, but not as much. So it's not facing direct light. Okay, so now we have 3 planes, and that's telling the story. That's kind of, what do we see with these planes? Well, they're flat. So you have general, when things are, the surface is kind of flat, you don't get much change here. Now, in reality, you do see things, like you'll see subtle gradients and stuff. It's more complicated, but we don't want to do that for now. You said simple forms, right? So this is simple. Just keep it flat. Okay, so we've got 3 planes that it's clear to see what is getting the most light, less light, and even less light. Okay. What about a cylinder? So a cylinder it's similar to a cube in that it has a flat plane. So let's just use the same lighting for all of them. Okay, so it's all coming from like that, like this direction, more side, but a little top. So the top surfaces will get a bit more. So we have, this plane is the same as that plane, right? So flat, and they get the same value. Okay, but now this is where we're gonna see some difference. Let's just clean that up a little bit. So what'll happen is the light's gonna hit this surface, but then at some point it's not going to be able to go all the way around, and so you get gradients. So usually we'll have a point where it switches from light side to shadow side. Like the light's gonna hit this part and it turns to shadow. So you'll get this area in shadow and this area in light. But what happens is that we get a bit of reflected light that bounces back into the object. So you get a situation where you have it light and then it gets darker and then it gets a bit lighter. But you see this light is still, this part is lighter than this part. This is still relatively darker than this. So you still know what's in the light, what's in the shadow. That's very important. Okay. Now for the circle. Actually, let's do the cone first. So the cone is like a cylinder, except it's resolving to a point. So you get the same kind of separation, but it gets very thin towards the point. So here, now we have a light and a shadow. Then we're going to get some reflected light on the other end, but now you have it where, and probably that light needs to be a little more like that. Okay, so now we have it resolve into a point, and so that's how you render a, and the bottom plane would just be like this, like it's flat, right? So that's how you'd get a cone, and then a sphere. Like the cylinder, we're going to have gradients, and it's going to start with light going around, and then there's also, like the cylinder, going to be a point where the light doesn't go any further, and then we have to add bounce light into it. Okay, so if the light's coming like roughly here, and there's a trick with cylinders, is that wherever the light's coming from, so let's say it's like coming at this angle, if you draw an angle perpendicular to this angle, so like that, 90 degrees, that, if you take that and you split the circle in half at that angle, so we said like it was coming at this, so like half of the circle at that angle. Okay, so now these 2 points at either end are where the terminator is going to originate. So depending then on what angle the light is coming, like the light's coming from this angle, but depending on whether it's like towards us or behind us, that shape is going to change, but it's always going to be connecting these 2 points, which are perpendicular to the angle of the light. So in this case, we have to figure out, okay, is the light coming like more like that, or is it more like that? If it just was dividing it perfectly in half, it would be like that. So let's say this seems to be a bit more like that based on the way I'm seeing this, because there is more in shadow than is in light in this situation, so we want the same thing. So then we do that, and then we put all this in shadow. Notice that I'll like put the whole shadow area in shadow first before I add the reflected light. The reason I'm doing that is so that you separate light and shadow first into light and shadow, and treat reflected light as part of the shadow. Okay, so there. This is how we think about shapes. Now there's one thing that's missing, which is highlight. So what about highlights? So highlights are something that are brighter than the light. And what a highlight really is it's a reflection of the light source. So if you imagine there's planes, if there's a plane that is, like if you had a bunch of planes, right? Let's say, like a bunch of these, a piece of paper that's folded, right? If the light's coming at an angle, if there's a surface perpendicular to that angle, the light's going to hit it and then bounce off it. And that's going to create a highlight. Like that's just going to light up because it's reflecting all the light. Whereas at this plane, it's not perpendicular, so some of the light is going to bounce around. And a highlight is when the light hits the object and then bounces right into your eye. So the highlight, the reflection of the light source, can move around depending on where you're looking at it. So if you move around, the highlight moves around. So how do we put highlights on these? So usually on a sphere, it's going to be a reflection of, like if it's the sun, it's going to be a circle highlight. If it's a window, you'll actually get a window shaped highlight. Let's say there was like a window and you've got something like this, then you will actually see that. So you might see a person's eye, for instance, and they have a highlight in their eye. And rather than it just being a circle, it's actually going to be, let's say it's coming from a window, it'll be like a curve because it's conforming to a curved space, but it'll be like a window shape. So that's what a highlight is. Okay, so let's put some highlights on. So where do highlights happen? On the sphere, it's going to be, let's say it's a circle. It's going to be like in the light, but bouncing like where we would see it. So probably like closer to here, maybe, where the light's hitting it and then bouncing into our eyes. Now I'm just making it up because I'm not using math to figure this out. I'm just like guessing, but that's what we need to do, is like, unless you're doing something extremely specific, in which case why not use a 3D rendering program? You just need to generally understand how this works. Okay, and then where else does it happen? So if the plane is perpendicular to the light, is this perfectly perpendicular? No. Is this? No. So neither of these is going to catch a highlight. But is there a point where you will catch a highlight? Well, yeah, because if you look at the edge of this, it looks like it's like, it goes this way and then that way. But the reality on any object is it's not perfectly smooth. Like if you zoomed in enough, you would see like even the edge of a box is going to look something like this. And then there's like an angle here, right? But there's also an angle here, and then 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 an angle here. One of these angles is going to be one of these tiny angles that is going to be perpendicular to the light source, and then it's going to catch a highlight. So you can put a highlight right on that corner because most likely one of those is going to catch a highlight. Same for this cylinder. Let's say there's a point here that catches a highlight, but also one of these planes is going to catch a highlight. So you get this like long highlight here that's like a band, and probably get a little bit of a gradient as well. And then on a cone, it's the same as a cylinder. It just resolves as a point like before. So it's a triangular. It's wider at the bottom. And also softer at the bottom, like more of a gradient, and more pointy towards the top. So those are our basic lighting situations. Either you've got a flat plane, you've got a circle with reflected light, cone with reflected light, cylinder with reflected light, and a flat plane. All right, so now that we've got all that, we want to look at this and what are these shapes? So now you've got to think about the shapes as combination. Like first think about where the light's coming from. Let's say the light's coming from the exact same place it was. Okay, what is this head? Like you're trying to, I can see there's like shading, but you're not thinking about the head as a big form. What you're thinking about is like hair and skin and eyes. You don't want to think about that. So what we're going to think about is not a head. We're going to think about a ball, because this head is roughly like an egg shape. So if you want to know how to light heads, you can get like an SRO head, which is helpful. But even simpler than that is an egg. If you learn how to, and it's more complicated than it looks, because an egg is not a perfect circle. But let's just assume this head was a perfect circle. So what are we doing here? Well, we've got, let me just put my colors down. So this is, actually, I'll just color pick from this. Okay. So there, we've got a light side where light is hitting, and the angle's at this point. So there's like, let's just start with the light. So it's always darkest at the terminator because it's not getting any reflected light, so it's not lighting up. So the light's coming from here, and let's say it's kind of like this. Okay. And this part's going to get thicker in the middle and thin out. The same way the cone is like thicker at the bottom because that's like the widest point, at least towards us. And we're going to make this whole thing in shadow. Okay. Now we're going to add some reflected light in the back. Okay, there we go. So that is how I would think about the head if I'm thinking about these shapes. Okay, now what else is like a ball? Well, you could actually think of her hair also like a ball there, and there's a ball there as well. Okay. There's a ball there. A sphere, I should say. And one there. And mostly, we could say there's one for the tail as well. Okay, so I just copied the ball, so the light's coming from all the same spots, but you can see how this is already starting to look three-dimensional. Okay, what about the leg? So the leg is a cylinder. Like, it's not perfectly a cylinder, but it's roughly a cylinder. So we're gonna shade it as if it was a cylinder. Let's get the light in there. And let's get the shadow. Again, it's gonna be thicker at the wider point and then thinner at the bottom point. But the light's coming from here. So most of this is actually gonna be in shadow. But let's say, go like that. For our shadow shape gets thicker here. All this is in shadow. So the most important thing you can think of first is to separate things into light and shadow. Don't even worry about reflected light, and then start to think about reflected light. But see, now this is looking three-dimensional. Okay, and we can take it and rotate for the other leg. There we go. And so now we have like cylinder, and then, okay, boxes. Oh, and there's cylinders as well for the arms, so we can do that. Just squeeze that. And you could say the shoulder is a sphere. I'm not going to do that because I think this is enough to get the point. Okay, now are there any boxes? Yeah, there are. So where would we see a boxy shape? Well, I see a box in the torso and the hips. They're kind of like straight. So we've got a box shape. Let's just draw it this way. So it's a bit, it's not quite a box, but it's kind of a box. It's a boxy shape. Okay, so we got this again. And actually this should be above. And it's getting complicated now with all the things. So whatever. Anyway. Okay. And then we have part of this box is in light. So that part's hitting the light. And then the rest is in shadow. Put that in shadow, and then the top surface is getting a bit of light as well. So maybe a bit more, maybe something like that. Okay, so now we have that sort of pointing that way. Now it's oversimplified, but again, we're doing very simple shapes here. And then the torso as well. You could think of it like a box. So again, it's not exactly a box. You're not going to do it perfectly like a box, but for the sake of this, we're going to treat it as if it was perfectly a box. And we're just roughly putting in some of these things. I'm trying to look for, let's just put it here, lower. Oh, here, and then, okay, so let's get this plane, oops, this plane, or let's make it in shadow first. So there's that, in shadow, that's in shadow, but this is getting more light, let's say. Okay, so we've got 3 planes. All right, now, let's move all these above. There we go. So now you have this basic 3D-esque thing. Does the tail have volume? Yes. Does the hair feel volumetric? Yes. There's other cylinders, like there's a cylinder for the neck. I guess we could just get that in. So there's a neck, really short cylinder. There, and put that underneath everything. There we go. Oh, I need to flip that horizontal because the light's coming from the opposite side. Okay, so there, now you kind of have this thing made out of basic shapes, but there's one thing that's really like, well, there's a bunch of things missing, but one major thing that's missing is cast shadows. So there are things that will block the light. So for instance, with this breast, it's getting hit by the light, but this one is also getting hit as if like this whole area would be hit by the light, but it wouldn't, because some of that light is going to be blocked by this one, which is in the way. So we can project that where that's going to be blocked. Let's make a new layer. So it's going to like, let's say, block it like that. So all this is going to be in shadow. And now we get more of like a expected shape, I guess, to what you might think. And then there's going to be, this part is going to actually connect like this, right? Like it's, here's where you can start to break it down into more understandable shapes. So this kind of behaves more like a cylinder, where you have areas that are going away from the light and you have a bit of a gradient. And then you see, and it's starting to look rounded now. It's starting to look more as you would expect it to look. This area, this arm, would cast a shadow on the body here. So we can kind of imagine where it would cast the shadow. And usually you want to keep cast shadows fairly sharp unless the shadow is away from the body. So let's say this, and then we've got this boxy part. So we can just start to smooth this out. And I'm not saying like you have to do this in every time you draw, you're going to be drawing basic shapes and then smoothing them out. That's not what you're going to do, but what you're going to do is start to look at the shapes you're making and analyze, like, generally, is this a different plane? Like here, this part of the rib cage here, it's kind of going in this direction. This one's going in this direction. So these are two different planes. So remember the box. If you've got two different planes, they're going to be different values. Okay, so this value and this value have to be different, but it's still roughly a box, so it's going to be relatively flat. So let's just make this value now. Okay. And as I do this, you're going to see how it starts to look three-dimensional. Right? There's going to be a shadow underneath the neck because this head is casting a shadow. Probably going to be a shadow on the body as well. So we're going to get that. There's going to be a smoother transition between the leg and the hips here. And this is not going to be so dark. There's going to be some light that bounces into it. So then you bounce some light into it. So hopefully you can see why I can't do clothing and forms. Like, you could spend easily a few weeks or months just focusing on how to render lighting. It's not a simple thing. And then for the hair, it's basically a sphere, but then you might think like, oh, but I wanted it to be pointy at the end. Well, what's pointy at the end? Cones, right? The cylinder. The cone. Okay, so basically it's like a cylinder that's been pinched and then it sort of blends into a circle. So how do we treat a cylinder? Think of it like a cylinder first. Okay, so you have the point, and then you have it sort of widen. This area is in shadow. Then we get some reflected light bouncing into it. And now this isn't going to be purely flat because there's a plane change here. So you're going to get a bit of a gradient as some of this plane turns away from the light. And also this head is blocking some of that light. Right? And then also on this part of the head, this hair is casting a shadow. So that again is going to block some of the light. But the reflected light is still going to bounce into it from behind. So you get something like this. And then usually where two objects meet, you get an occlusion shadow. So you get areas where light just can't bounce into it. And easy way of looking at occlusion shadows is just take your finger and then, so here's like your finger, right? And then bend your finger like that. And you'll notice in the wrinkles between the creases of your finger, it's going to get darker and darker. That's occlusion, where light is having a harder and harder time getting into the crease of your finger. So this part's going to get darker, right? Okay, so now this is basically it. Okay, and then finally you'd have the highlights. Now with highlights, I'd actually recommend at this stage not even thinking about them. Highlights are where people tend to get lost. They think about things like, oh, I've got to add highlights, and they want to put highlights everywhere. And the two mistakes is, one is they'll put too many highlights or make them too big, and the other Well, it's those two. So they either make them too big, which you don't seem to have that problem with, or they put them everywhere. Now, the thing with materials is highlights are reflections of the light source. Remember that, they're reflections. So what is a reflective surface? It's very smooth, right? Like a mirror is super smooth, that's why it's reflective. Okay, so if a surface is not smooth, it's going to be less reflective. You'll still get highlights, but because like if you think of a smooth surface, it's like this. Like let's say you zoom in on it, it's kind of like that. You think of a rough surface like sandpaper, it's like this, right? Like it's got a lot of grit to it. So what happens in this case? Well, light hits at an angle and bounces off. And it hits at an angle and bounces off, and it hits at an angle and it bounces off. And as this light hits on top of each other, that highlight gets more strong. Whereas in this, light might hit here and bounce like there. It might hit here and bounce there. So rough surfaces scatter the light as light hits it, and it bounces at different angles. And so you don't get a sharp highlight. This case you get a sharp highlight, this case you do not. So if your material is rough, you do not want highlights. You don't want highlights on, for instance, her t-shirt. But you do want light and dark separation. Now, the other thing is, because of you're dealing with fabric here, I rendered it as if there were two spheres beside each other. But they're not just beside each other. They're covered by fabric that is flattening this out. So it's making this surface more like the cube, right? Because we have a flat plane. So that's going to be like that. Maybe you get a few indications of some wrinkles, but generally this is going to be flat. So this is how you want to think of things. You're basically breaking things down into basic shapes. So this leg is going to cast a shadow onto this other leg, and you get this kind of highlight. This part of the leg is going to flow smoothly into this part, and that almost takes on more of a cylindrical quality because you've got this boxier hip section that flows very nicely into this other cylindrical section. You get these types of shapes. Same thing that we did to the hair, we do here, where this turns into like a cone shape. And then, yeah, again, I don't think about highlights, but when I do, how do you think of highlights? Where do they hit? They'll hit on, if this is like a sphere here, then you've got a cylinder. That's why they say to break things down into like these basic shapes, because I don't know how to render necessarily a deltoid and a tricep, but I know how to render a sphere and a cylinder, right? So sphere, you'll get the highlight like a point. Cylinder, it'll be like a line. Here's another cylinder, you'll get a line. Here's a sphere, you'll get a point. Okay, so, oops, let's just undo all that and do it on its own there. So if this was a very reflective shoulder, you get your point. Then this is a cylinder, get your line, and we covered it with the, it should be like that, so then you'll get another highlight like that if you have it. Again, if they're very reflective. Things are much less reflective often than we think they are, so people are so eager to put down highlights, and then it just looks worse as they put more and more highlights, because it's like, not everything is this reflective. I feel like it's worse, so I prefer if you actually didn't think about any highlights at all, and save that value for like rim lights and stuff. Tends to look nicer, or just plain separation. So for instance, if I want this to stand out, I could use that value that we haven't used, the light, and use it to pop this out, right? So you see how three-dimensional this is becoming. and that's how we think about light. There's a lot more to it, but I think this is enough for a quick rundown how to think about light. So yeah, I hope this helps, and thanks for watching.